back. WNST, Tass in Baltimore, and WNST.net. We are headed to Super Bowl 51 next week in Houston, and in honor of that, we're going to be expanding the conversation with many sports journalists around here, and it won't just be about Tom Brady and Matt Ryan and Bob Kraft and Arthur Blank, but certainly through all sports next week, as well as some celebrities, some rock stars, and whatnot. I got a guy here whose story made its way to my desk last week during the Baseball Hall of Fame voting, and many of you realize I had my press pass taken away after 21 years, 11 years ago by Peter Angelos. I probably would have been a guy voting for Halls of Fames and that sort of stuff by now had I decided to go down that path, and many have that, you have their little punch card. They're now shared out on Twitter, and everyone can see everyone's ballots, and it's a little more transparent than, let's say, the Football Hall of Fame is at this point. This guy covers all of that and more. He's a longtime journalist covering the politics of sports business. He wrote about how sports writers voting for the Hall of Fame is kind of wacky, and I don't disagree with him. You can follow his journey out on Twitter at Evan J. Weiner. It is Weiner. He is a writer, a pundit, and lecturer. We welcome him onto the program for the first time, even though we are Facebook friends. Evan, a pleasure, man. How are you? Welcome in here to discuss something that's very near and dear to my heart, and certainly should be to any American that watched these shenanigans over the weekend down at the White House.
Yeah, well, welcome. Thank you for your welcoming to your show. And I got a story for you before we go on. The Baltimore Sun, back in 2002, I was writing op-ed pieces for Richard Gross on the news side. And the Baltimore Sun killed an op-ed piece that I did. It was during the 2002 lead up to a possible baseball strike, and fans never being able to hit back at owners for strikes.
Well, Mr. Angelos wouldn't want to see that in the newspaper, Evan. I mean,
no.
Mr. Angelos spends lots of money and writes checks to the Baltimore Sun for that ad space, and they write checks to him for that little clock out in center field that nobody seems to understand. And when they went bankrupt, they weren't paying their bills. Back in the day when the Tribune Company went upside down. There's all sorts of things that just gets brushed under the rug, and ethics becomes a major part of this.
Well, I was going to tell you the Baltimore Sun piece I did in August of 2002. Richard Gross was the editor there at that time. He's long gone. And he approved it. And I said, hey, look, baseball fans, you want to get back at your owners? Boycott their other businesses. The Baltimore Sun told me, somebody told me, we don't do boycotts. And I said, what about apartheid in South Africa? That was the end of the conversation. The piece never saw the light of day. Newspapers and baseball have a very, very long history. Newspapers, Chicago Tribune owned the Chicago Cubs for a while. Gannett had a piece of the Cincinnati Reds through the Cincinnati Enquirer. So there's a very, very long history. Let's face it, baseball, back when it started, got a lot out of newspapers because very few people actually did see baseball games back at the turn of the century. There were people who probably never saw the Cleveland Spiders but could recite the Cleveland Spiders roster of 1899. With that in mind, the Baseball Hall of Fame probably knew that going to baseball writers was a good thing for them to vote back in the 1930s. Their thing was, hey, these people see all the games, which wasn't true because if you lived in Pittsburgh or if you lived in Cincinnati, you never saw an American League team. But these guys were giving free publicity to baseball. Newspapers were giving free publicity to newspapers, and who better?
Well, they created a whole section for it. I mean, the sports section and sports radio. I bought this company 20 years ago to specifically sit around and talk about the Orioles all day. And then they stunk and they lied and they did horrific things to lots of people. And I had to go public with that. And for that, I was thrown out of the press box in 2006.
Hey, I've been barred from locker rooms 1983 when the Oilers and the Islanders played for the Stanley Cup. All of a sudden, Bill Tooley said, you're not allowed in the locker room. And I said, what'd I do? He said, you asked too many tough questions.
Okay. Well, this has been brewing for a long time, long before alternative truth. Have you ever heard alternative truth? Just don't take that on politically or for the dingbat that said it on Sunday, but just what is an alternative truth to you, to a guy that writes about journalism?
I think it's a lie, but I
okay.
I also think that a lot of PR guys in sports actually spin the alternative truth also, but never called it alternative truth.
Well, I guess the alternative truth as we talk about the Baseball Hall of Fame is it's stickier than just who votes, right? It's who is voted upon, and the real problem here is there really is no credential, right? It used to be, well, if you have 500 home runs and 3,000 hits, you're in. If you struck out 3,000 guys, you had a 300 game winner, whatever those magic numbers used to be in my youth in the 70s and 80s. And, of course, my cousin's in the Baseball Hall of Fame. My family name's on the wall there. There's a little piece of that I've always had some pride in throughout my life. But, Evan, I'm 48 now. I went to Cooperstown about a year and a half ago. I broadcast from up there with the mayor of Cooperstown and with Jeff Idelson and all that. And I'm not being disrespectful to them as much as I'm being disrespectful to the whole process of what the Hall of Fame is supposed to represent, what it's supposed to be other than a library. And then we get to who votes on these guys and what makes you eligible or ineligible. And I guess it could all start with Pete Rose and work its way through Bonds and A-Rod and Clemens and all of these other players who were great on the field, but around the edges there's something that makes sports writers want to hold their nose.
Well, getting back to the whole concept, the Baseball Hall of Fame is a museum. That's what it is. It's not unlike the British Museum in London, and of course most of the stuff in the British Museum was ransacked and stolen to bring back to the British Museum. But then again, if they didn't do it, who knows what would have happened to all that good stuff. But it's a museum. It's a dead place. It's a place of plaques and busts and pictures and maybe some old audio recordings and some videos. But it's basically a museum, and people go to the museum not to necessarily see a plaque on the wall, but they go to see, why would you go to the British Museum? Because there are old paintings, or there's old sculpture from ancient Egypt that's there, that's accessible to you. So that's probably the same thing with baseball and baseball fans. I think the real diehards take it way too seriously, way too seriously. And I think that the baseball writers tend to take it way too seriously as well. You know what? Pud Galvin admitted he took some sort of performance enhancer in 1889. You got guys like Connie Mack, who didn't allow African Americans in his baseball park. Not just on the field, but he didn't want African Americans. I remember having a friend, Felix Anthony, who's now in his 70s, who grew up in Philadelphia, and he said, I couldn't go to A's games. He didn't want me, so we went to see Phillies games because they said, okay, you could come in and be part of the crowd. So you got guys like that in the Hall of Fame. You got people like Ty Cobb. There were a couple stories about Cobb saying that at the end of his life, he kind of renounced what he was at the beginning of his life. And, Babe Ruth certainly wasn't a guy who, you might want to go partying with Babe Ruth, but Babe wasn't exactly a guy that was on the straight and narrow all the time. So, but the thing that bothers me as a journalist is that we are supposed to vote for this particular award or that award in the NFL. And there's an ethics problem with it. Now, if you're retired and not active, it's no big deal. But if you're an active journalist, you should not be voting on an award, yay or nay, that can enhance somebody's reputation and also put money in his pocket. I have a friend who votes for the Academy Awards, Bill Goldstein, who did the music for Fame back in the 1980s, and he is on two committees for the Oscars, one for foreign films, and I forgot the other one, but he's a composer. And we're talking one day, he says, well, the Los Angeles Times isn't allowed to vote for the Academy Awards because you're covering that subject. Now, Bill's a peer. So why not have peers vote instead of writers? Now, my most favorite example of why a writer should not be voting for the Hall of Fame is Dick Young and Tom Seaver. Tom Seaver was run out of New York in 1977 because M. Donald Grant and the Mets didn't want to give him more money. At the time, Dick Young's son-in-law, Thornton Geary, was working for M. Donald Grant. And Dick Young had a very long history of doing promotional work for the New York Mets, whether it was the old promotional videos that they did in the 1960s or program pieces or writing pieces of the yearbook. When you hear about writers, well, they're not tied to anything, that they're free to vote, not necessarily the case. If you read Ball Four, Jim Bound's book, he talked about Jim Ogle virtually being part of the Yankee front office, the Newark Star-Ledger writer. A lot of writers get paid by teams, or used to get paid by teams. Not that much money, but they took money from teams to write program pieces. But a guy like Vin Scully, who has seen it all since 1950, is not allowed to vote because he took money from O'Malley, or he took money from the brewery that sponsored O'Malley's broadcast back in Brooklyn. So he's conflicted of interest, according to the Baseball Hall of Fame, because he might vote for one of his guys because he's got that conflict of interest.
Everyone has a conflict of interest, though. All these guys went in and had to deal with Jim Rice, and they didn't like him, so they persecuted him as far as they could. Same thing will be said for A-Rod or Bonds, who is a complete jerk, and no one's ever going to personally want to get supportive of that. My question is just these honors and this sort of realm of Hall of Fame. I've said all along, Pete Rose made so much more money not getting in the Hall of Fame than he ever would have made had they just forgotten about this Giamatti thing back in the 90s and put him in 1994. The last 23 years, he wouldn't be out on the circuit complaining about it. I mean, he's gotten a lot more traction and made a lot more money, and is being not in the Hall of Fame has been good for Pete Rose.
Well, the other thing, it's funny. I was at the gym yesterday watching the 30 for 30 series about Darryl Strawberry and Doc Gooden. And I was around back in those days, and everybody knew what was going on with Doc and Darryl. And
can you imagine those guys in the world of Twitter and
yeah? Well,
and
it wasn't just Doc and it just wasn't Doc and Darryl on that team. Lenny Dykstra ended up in jail from that team, and there were some other things that happened that we'll probably let somebody else talk about. But Wally Backman never did get a chance to manage in the major leagues, partly because of off-field problems that occurred with the Mets. But, getting back to Doc and Darryl, why weren't Doc, Darryl, Steve Howe, Rod Scurry, why Alan Wiggins looked after more? The writers knew they could have put pressure on Major League Baseball, the Players Association, and teams to say, hey, look, are you taking care of your guys? But getting back to Pete Rose, well, let's go after Rose. Let's go after Rose. Let's go after Rose. And they kind of ignored the cocaine problems in the 1980s, and let's just concentrate on Rose and gambling because what he did was an embarrassment to the game and a blemish on the game. Those other guys doing coke in Pittsburgh and the Pittsburgh clubhouse with the Pittsburgh Parrot and Scurry and Howe. Steve Howe came back 7 times. 7 times. And yet, the writers concentrated on that. The writers also, when the problem in the 1990s, after the baseball strike, and the owners were found guilty of unfair bargaining, if you remember, by Judge Sotomayor.
I remember it all very, very, very vividly. I've reported on it all my life. I mean, baseball has an ugly. We can go through any era here, whether it's Black Sox scandals, drug scandals, Lords of the Realm, collusion, racism, Curt Flood. I mean, the story and the history of baseball is just sleazy from the beginning, kind of, sort of, right?
It still is.
Of course.
And still is. I mean, the A-Rod thing in South Florida, where Selig basically tried to strong-arm the Miami New Times publisher, Chuck Strauss, and he told them to go somewhere. But, the thing is, the writers do what the owners want them to do for the most part. And they know when to write, what to write about, and they know that if you actually go against the grain, they're going to cut off your access. It's not only the owners that will cut off your access, the players will cut off your access. And if they cut off, particularly in the old days when there were newspapers that actually competed against one another, these guys actually, even though they worked together, they would have had a scoop and they would have held back on the scoop and printed it, and there was more competition. Today, I don't think there's competition. First of all, baseball's taken away the newspaper's importance because they have their own website and they have their own network. So they can do whatever they want now. They control, actually, the news flow. And that's another problem. Some of the writers actually write for MLB.com who are voting on the Hall of Fame. So you can't do that. Now, is there a better way of doing this? Sure. I mean, you go and get peers who understand the game, know the game inside out, and have no problems with personality. They just look at it in black and white. Here's the records. Here's what the guys did. And, you know, George Young once told me something about football. And I'll get to the Football Hall of Fame in a second. He said, I defy the average person or writer to tell me if I have generic jerseys on offensive linemen, tell me who's the better offensive left guard. Just tell me that. If you didn't know the guy's name and the guy didn't have a reputation, just tell me who's better if you just watched him with a generic jersey on.
Well, I've been doing this a long time. How much a sports writer or a sportscaster or a guy like me would really know tactically about football is basically on how much access you have to be taught. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Look, I learned very early on when Marvin Lewis and Jim Schwartz were here, and through the era, Rex Ryan and Mike Patton, where I would go out and sit in meeting rooms with those guys and try to learn football more, just how little I knew, how little the people in the press box know that haven't played the game. But then, the guy in the upper deck that's more interested in drinking beer than he really is learning the 3-4 defense.
Yeah, well, the other thing about the Football Hall of Fame and writers is Dan Grassi in Cleveland. When Modell, who did so much for the league in the 1960s, he negotiated all their TV deals. Now, forget the fact Modell was a rotten business guy, which he was, but and always in debt. But he was instrumental in the rise of football because he was a TV guy. Roselle didn't know anything about TV. Tex Schramm was there, and Tex Schramm had been at CBS Sports. But it was Modell, who had the TV background, that got them the money in the NFL. Sonny Werblin got them the money in the AFL. And just based on that alone, Art Modell should be in the Hall of Fame. Dan Grassi, of course, had his issues with Modell leaving because he lost his job, which was the Cleveland Browns beat writer. He was the beat writer for the Cleveland Browns. And all of a sudden, he had no beat to cover. So he made an impassioned plea to the football writers and the others in the room and said, you can't put Art in, and Art should be in the Hall of Fame.
Yeah, well, Tony Grossi, I see him all the time. It's very obvious he was the key figure in keeping Art Modell out of the Hall of Fame. And, of course, David passed away last week here in Baltimore as well, and we spent the week talking about him. We're on the line with Evan Weiner. He is a writer, pundit, lecturer, and a keeper of the journalism flame. You can follow him out at Evan J. Weiner. That's Weiner, out on Twitter. Inked a great piece last week about who votes for these halls of fame in regard to Cooperstown and in regard to that ballot. And look, the whole Cooperstown story is just a mess, right? Trying to pass the eyeball test for steroids users. We've known for 20 years this was going to be an issue for anyone voting on the Hall of Fame, right? That's just sort of a built-in part of this as to whether Fred McGriff was clean, Mike Piazza was clean, Pudge Rodriguez. We go through these guys, and I don't know that Ortiz is going to touch the Hall of Fame, and certainly Barry Bonds and the best players, Clemens. These guys, they're never going to get in the Hall of Fame with this particular group of voters.
Well, no, and the thing, I brought up the British Museum, and do people actually inquire as to how that stuff ended up in the British Museum? You go to the British Museum, you say, hey, look at that stuff from 700 BC from Egypt. And
the ownership would be disputed, is what you're saying, right?
Yes, it was very much. But that's like that in a lot of museums, right?
We don't think of was it stolen to be put in front of me. It's just there, and we're happy to see it.
Yeah, and that's the way it should be with the baseball museum. Look, Pete Rose is in the Hall of Fame. He just doesn't have a plaque in the Hall of Fame. And the thing is, if you like baseball, if you like baseball history, you want to know about baseball history, you go there. Of course, Cooperstown was built on the lie and the myth. Actually, it was built on alternate facts.
Correct. alternate facts, alternate
It
truths.
was, if you look at Cooperstown and the whole myth of Cooperstown, it was built on alternate facts.
Abner Doubleday, absolutely.
Well,
Hey,
no, the guy who's the drunk who they came up with the story, who said, "Oh yeah, Abner Doubleday and all this other stuff." That's actually, if you look at it realistically, the myth of Cooperstown and the birthplace of baseball and all that other stuff, and it's a lovely area. It's right on the lake up there. It's a great place to go in the summer. It's nice. It's cool up there, and you get to go through history and not only that, there's James Fenimore Cooper is up there and all that.
and it's a great museum. It's a great place to visit. But this whole argument over who is and who isn't, I'm almost 50 years old. I just don't care anymore. I don't care whether Barry Bonds gets in the Hall of Fame or whether they throw my cousin out. I mean, I literally, I've just. And I used to spend long stretches of time back in the 90s here on sports radio having these debates as to whether Burt Blyleven and Don Sutton belonged in or not. I don't care to have those debates anymore. I think it's like a waste of energy, to be honest with you.
Well, I got a better one for you. You think the average 13-year-old who likes baseball cares?
Oh, not at all. Not at all. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
I mean, that's the whole thing. I mean, who is right now? Who's the target for Cooperstown? And I've seen this over baseball. Baseball has forgotten about you got to cultivate your next generation. I mean, if you look in hockey, they try to do that. In basketball, they certainly do that. And with the individual stars, whether it was Michael Jordan and Be Like Mike or LeBron James today, who is baseball cultivating that you really want to go see and like? Because baseball, over the years I've covered, has run down its players. They have run down their players for 4 decades, or more, actually, going back to Kurt Flood.
Other than Cal Ripken, who's clean, right? Literally.
Well, I guess he is. I don't know.
Jeter, I guess, except that he used to give autographed baseballs to the girls he dated. But, I mean, the scuttlebutt's out on everybody. Even Ripken's divorced now, right? I mean,
yeah, I've heard the Mike Flanagan stories about Ripken as well.
Yeah, so. I mean, it does bring some great sadness for guys like you and me that collected baseball cards back when we were kids, and it all sort of began with us having hero worship for whomever the guy in our era was when we were a kid. We all wanted to grow up and be Jim Palmer or Brooks Robinson or Cal Ripken or whomever. Here, kids have lacrosse sticks, right? I mean, kids are playing soccer. They're doing other stuff. Baseball has bigger problems than who's in the Hall of Fame. I would agree with you. One problem they don't have is they're making plenty of money, Evan.
Yeah, they have more money coming in than they know what to do with. But that goes to the politics of sports and goes back to Ronald Reagan in 1984 signing the Cable TV Act into law, which I talked to at colleges, and also the 1986 tax code reform, which brought you the new stadiums in Baltimore and all the other places as well. But we could sit there and talk about those issues.
Next conversation. Next time I have you on, we're going to do that. Let's do that.
In fact, Ronald Reagan should be in every sports Hall of Fame out there because Ronald Reagan actually transformed the game. And I'm going to leave you with this one. You could answer the question now or you could answer the question later. Who is the most important person in the history of football?
Most important person in the history of football. All right, I'll come back to that. All right, that'll be our dangling, and we'll see whether you come up with an alternative fact or a real one.
No, this cannot be disputed. This guy is actually, in fact, Art Modell and I had this discussion about 20 years ago, and after I explained it to him, Art Modell said, "Son of a bee." He said, "I never thought of it. You convinced me, and you're absolutely 100% correct." But then again, I liked Art. Art liked me back in the day. But that's the kind of conversation I would have with Art. And this guy in Art Modell says, you know what? It's not George Halas. You're absolutely right with what you came up with.
Well, anybody who's a friend of Art Modell is somebody I want to know. Evan, in my studio, in my studio cam, I only have one picture of a human being in here. I have a couple bobbleheads, Marsha Brady, George Brett, a couple of those, but only one picture. It's a picture of Art Modell, and Art had an office over at the stadium that I did sort of the quintessential sit down with him. I did a 3-hour interview that I play as part of our best of talking about his life and times. And he had a whole wall of what he called his dead friends. And he had pictures of all his friends on the wall. There's George Preston Marshall up there. And he went one by one through the people on the wall, including Pete Rozelle and a bunch of other people. So that was a lot of fun. So next time, Evan Weiner, you and I will start with Art Modell, and I'm sure it'll degenerate.
Well, actually, it would be who the most important person was in the history of football in this country.
Okay, well, I'm throwing Rozelle out as A, B, C, or D, or E. But I know you're going to go off the reservation, so I don't even want to know. I want to have like a Dallas sort of ending dangling till the next episode.
Hey, you know what? Your listeners could look it up. They'll never figure it out either. So, but it's out there. It's a famous figure, but they won't figure it out. They'll say, "Oh, Red Grange, who was instrumental in keeping the NFL going," but it wasn't Red Grange.
Okay. Evan J. Weiner. You can follow him out on Twitter. Writer, pundit, lecturer, and keeper of the journalism flame. Great having you on, Evan. Thanks for being a great guest.
Looking forward to the next time.
So am I, absolutely. Evan Weiner joining us here. You can find him out on Twitter. He's also on LinkedIn and Facebook and writes a journalism blog as well at evanjweiner.com as well. You can find me out in the Bayou Toyota Audio Vault 24 hours a day from anywhere in the world on your mobile device by downloading the TuneIn Radio app. We do come in crystal clear from anywhere in the world. Our morning newspaper shipped to your email inbox every morning at 7 a.m. It comes to you courtesy of Planet Fitness and PlanetFitness.com. Still $10 a month to get in awesome shape, and you can learn more and get inspired at PlanetOfTriumphs.com. Any breaking news that happens out there, Ravens, Orioles, Terps, comes to you first on the WNST text service. That is all brought to you by our friends at Coons Ford of Security Boulevard. Dennis will be here on Thursday, driving you home from 3 until 5, getting you ready for the Reese's Senior Bowl and my man Phil Savage, and then we're off to Houston next week for Super Bowl 51. If you want to go to London with us, our WNST road trip to London is on sale now on the website. Just click on the road trips tab. We'd love to have you along. I'm really getting excited about this. Doing a lot of research on London. I think I'm going to go over in the spring and get a little lay of the land to make sure all the people are. We're expecting to take about 300 people with us. We have almost 75 people now on the list. WNST.net. Click on the road trips tab, and we're going to London. So how about that? Nasty at WNST.net finds me. Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, Snapchat, Instagram, and streaming live on our Facebook, as well as our YouTube WNSTV channel. We are WNST.net, AM 1570, and WNST Towson, Baltimore, and we never stop talking Baltimore sports.